Welcome to the Newberry Center for Renaissance Studies, Learning from Premodern Plagues video series. I'm Elisa Jones, Assistant Professor of History at the College of Charleston and a former postdoctoral fellow with the center. In this episode, we will enter the world of premodern plagues through a document in the Newberry's rich French pamphlet collection called the Discours politique au roi, or Political Discourse to the King. This pamphlet was written in France in the 17th century, by which time outbreaks of plague had become a regular occurrence. We know that every year from 1500 to 1770, there were outbreaks of plague somewhere in the kingdom. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Paris had a plague outbreak on average once every 3 years. We referred to this printed document as a pamphlet because it was printed inexpensively in a format that was intended to make it cheap to buy and easy to distribute. Just over 6 inches high and only 32 pages, this copy likely survived when it was bound with other pamphlets by a collector. This genre of cheap print flourished in the 17th centuries and the 16th centuries in France, a time that was marked by religious and civil wars, as well as a series of minor kings. This pamphlet was written by Pierre de Moulier, an advocate in a lower sovereign judicial court, and published in Paris in 1618. Moulier insists that the discourse is a published version of a letter addressed to the King Louis XIII, who was crowned at the age of 9 in 1610 with the assassination of his father, Henry IV, but the letter was sealed and never received. The discourse is organized around the idea that the kingdom is composed of 4 humors: blood, bile, melancholy, and phlegm, that corresponded to the 4 elements of air, fire, earth, and water. Just as contemporary medicine from antiquity through the early modern period believed to be the case in the body of a person. Moulier identifies the corresponding parts of the kingdom as the nobility, the church, the people, and justice. Much of early modern European medicine centered around the idea that if the humors were out of balance in a body, it was susceptible to disease. In this pamphlet, Moulier argues that, just like in a body, if these elements of the kingdom are out of balance, it can also suffer from disease. Moulier then takes the metaphor of the body politic and examines the real threat disease posed for the people within it. Without proper order and management, he warns, popular disease leads to large numbers of casualties, which the king must prevent for the public good. His examples are the plague and the transmission of disease in public places by prostitutes and potential lepers. In the discourse, we see an explanation of what Moulier calls the pestilence based on the theory that it is caused by bad air, or miasma. Rejecting the idea that this is the result of the movement of the stars, which was popular at the time, he insists that the infection is the direct result of the physical decay and decomposition of bodies and the release of vapors into the air. To prevent this, he urges the king to establish a regulation to ensure that, in his own words, the truly dead are promptly buried in very deep graves, and that graves and sepulchres not be opened during putrefaction. He also suggests setting up facilities for the care of the wounded far from towns, equipped with chimneys designed to heat and dry the air in order to prevent patients from becoming infected with the pestilence. These measures should be paid for using public funds, Moulier insists, since the peril is common to all. To further prevent disease through this method of contagion, he also urges the king to separate lepers from the population, and finally, to verify the health of prostitutes. The problem of infection, contagion, and large numbers of dead only increased in the years after Moulier published this advice to the king. In the 17th century, France had a population of about 20 million people, and it lost at least 2.5 million in that same period to the plague. From the mid-17th century on, however, after a particularly devastating pandemic from 1628 to 1631 that likely killed 1 million people in southern France and another million in Italy, governments in Europe had adopted policies of containment and began to more actively coordinate responses to disease, such as limiting travel and the sizes of public gatherings during outbreaks, and enforcing quarantines of affected towns. From 1500 to 1700, officials were created to deal with quarantining infected families and fumigating their houses with the help of public funds, and boards of health were set up to supervise their efforts. While the implementation of these policies varied, when they were put into place, restrictions and regulations brought opposition. The church sometimes objected to bans on religious processions or their size, for example. And people who had been forced to quarantine in their homes or in public pest houses would attempt to escape. As we see in this archaeological image of a plague burial site from the last major outbreak of plague in France in 1720 and 1721, during which half of the population of the city of Marseille alone died, large numbers of deaths, and the burial of the dead was not only a product of early plague pandemics. The images of bodies overwhelming morgues around the world during our own COVID-19 pandemic and the attempts to both control and prevent the spread of disease through government regulation are a reminder that the terrors that Europe faced from repeated plague outbreaks in the early modern period are not as distant as they sometimes seem. When confronted with regulations and resistance to them today, it is worth remembering that the continued need to respond to outbreaks of plague and other diseases from the 14th century onwards led to the development of what we know today as public health agencies and government oversight over disease prevention and management. Modern science can also accurately diagnose both causes and treatments for diseases using technology that was just unavailable to early modern European doctors. As Moulier explained in his political discourse, when people came together to form states, they made what is called a civil society, and the public control of disease is needed to combat a common peril to all its members. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Learning from Premodern Plagues. Please be in touch with any questions by emailing renaissance@newberry.org, and stay well.